The Hall of Concordance was a monument to galactic arrogance. It soared above the assembled delegates, a vast amphitheater whose walls were not built of stone or alloy, but of stabilized light, projections of the nebulae and supernovae that marked the borders of the three elder species. The Silphori, the Krevesh, and the Orathi had gathered their most decorated minds for this singular purpose, to witness the final test of the new applicants from the Orion Spur, to see if the creatures from Earth deserved to speak, or if they would be returned to their backwater system with a polite, crushing letter of rejection. The human delegation sat in a pool of stark white light at the center of the floor. Ambassador Voss, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a posture forged in decades of diplomatic trenches, kept her face a mask of cold neutrality. Beside her, the engineer Wren looked profoundly out of place. He was a man built for shipyards, not symposiums, broad shoulders filling a simple black jumpsuit, hands scarred from decades of mechanical work resting on his knees. He hadn't said a word in over an hour. The Silphori Proctor, a willowy being with skin like burnished copper and eyes that held the vast, cold depth of space, began the proceedings. His voice, translated through a silvery orb floating near his throat, dripped with condescending grace. "This is merely a formality," he intoned, the words echoing in 1,000 different translation fields across the chamber. "A simple demonstration of cognitive capability to ensure the foundational metrics of sentient analysis are met. We require no grand feats, only competence." From the air before him, a shape coalesced. It was a cube, perhaps 30 centimeters across, its surface a maddening swirl of interconnected geometric fractals that shifted and turned in dimensions the human eye was never meant to perceive. It was simultaneously matte black and blindingly bright, its internal structure a hypnotic dance of angles folding into nothingness. "This is a logic frame," the proctor continued, a thin smile gracing his alien features. "It is a child's puzzle among our kind, a test of multidimensional spatial reasoning. The goal is to align its internal symmetries into a singular, harmonious state. Our greatest theoretical minds can achieve this in a few hours. We will allow your specimen, your engineer, a full planetary rotation. We understand you are neurologically limited." A ripple of what could only be described as polite snickering moved through the alien galleries. The Krevesh attaché, a hulking, scaled brute named Cathar, let out a guttural sound that was the equivalent of a sneer. The Orathi, a species of living silicate, simply stared with their unsettling, faceted eyes, recording everything. Ambassador Voss did not flinch. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see Wren's profile. He was staring at the shifting cube with an expression she had learned to recognize. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't awe. It was the quiet, predatory focus of a master diagnostician looking at a faulty plasma coupling. He was already dismantling it in his head, piece by impossible piece. "Wren," Voss said, her voice low enough that the translators didn't catch it. "Don't break it." The corner of Wren's mouth twitched. "I'll try not to." He stood. The action was so unexpected, so free of the ritualistic bowing and permission-asking the aliens were accustomed to, that the proctor actually took a half step back. Wren walked towards the floating puzzle, his heavy boots making soft, steady footfalls on the polished deck. He didn't circle it with academic uncertainty. He stopped directly in front of it, close enough that the shifting light painted his face in stark, dancing shadows. He raised his hands. The Silphori proctor made a soft, chastising noise. "You may use the interface stylus provided. Direct physical contact is ill-advised. The dimensional shearing effects can disorient the unprepared sensory cortex." Wren did not take the stylus. He didn't even acknowledge the proctor had spoken. His scarred, calloused fingers touched the surface of the logic frame. A wave of distorted perception washed over him, a sickening lurch that tried to convince his brain that left was forward and inside was yesterday. A lesser mind would have collapsed into a seizure. Wren's mind, however, was not a pristine gallery of theoretical knowledge. It was a junkyard of practical cause and effect, honed by diagnosing failing warp cores while under fire and jury-rigging life support systems with nothing but a wrench and spite. Chaos was his workshop. He closed his eyes for one long, terrifying second. The Silphori chittered in anticipation of a neural collapse. The Krevash warlord leaned forward, hopping for the scream. Then Ren's eyes snapped open. His hands began to move. He didn't trace the shifting fractals, trying to map their infinite flowing permutations. Instead, his fingers dove straight into the core of the mechanism, finding the non-shifting anchor points, the structural nodes that the patterns flowed around. The aliens were transfixed by the beautiful, ever-changing picture. Ren felt the ugly, static frame that held it all together. He found the skeleton beneath the kaleidoscopic skin. His movements were not a dance. They were a surgery, a brutal, efficient, three-dimensional realignment of fundamental geometry. Twice, his hand seemed to blur, passing through a dimensional shear that would have phased a stylus right through the intended target. But human touch, the direct feedback of 60 billion nerve endings, told him where the reality of the object lay. He wasn't solving a puzzle. He was diagnosing a machine. 3 minutes and 52 seconds later, the logic frame shuddered. The chaotic, shifting patterns snapped into a single, breathtakingly perfect alignment. A resonant, pure chord of light bloomed from the object, filling the hall of concordance with a sound that was also a color, a universal sigh of mathematical perfection. Ren let his hands drop to his sides. The silence that followed was a physical pressure. The Silphori proctor's mouth was agape, a breach of decorum so severe it was a distress call. Cathar's scaled fist was clenched, cracking the armrest of his stone seat. The Orathi hummed, a low-frequency vibration that translated not as shock, but as the deepest reverence their ancient race could express. Ambassador Voss allowed herself a single, slow breath. They had passed the test. They had silenced the arrogance of 3 elder empires. They had proven humanity's intelligence. The political door, closed for a century, now stood open. She began to rise, preparing the speech she had written for this exact moment, words designed to forge this triumph into a binding treaty. But Ren didn't turn around. He didn't move back to his seat. He was still staring at the solved puzzle, his head cocked to the side, his expression not one of victory, but of deep, profound annoyance. "Wait," he said, the word cutting through the charged silence like a blade. The proctor's shaky composure began to rebuild. "Your performance is satisfactory. The test is complete. You may." "I said wait," Ren repeated, his voice utterly flat. He reached out and touched the perfect, glowing surface of the solved artifact with a single probing finger. "There's a catch, right there, on the 7th fold." The aliens blinked. "The puzzle is solved. There is no catch," the proctor said, a tremor of uncertainty entering his voice. "The geometry is now in a state of divine harmony." Ren finally turned, looking back at Ambassador Voss with an expression she couldn't quite read. "My kit," he said, ignoring the proctor entirely. "The one from the shuttle, I need it. This thing's got a stress fracture." The declaration was so absurd, so utterly sacrilegious, that the chamber's environmental system itself seemed to gasp. The humans hadn't just passed the test. The engineer was asking for tools, because he thought their sacred artifact was broken, and he wanted to fix it. The logic of chaos had always made sense to Ren. Where the Silphori saw a divine harmony of shifting geometry, he saw a load-bearing structure straining against its own flaws. The catch, he felt on the 7th fold, wasn't a feature. It was a microscopic scream of fatigued material. It was the vibration of a failing bolt in a ship's hull, the thermal microfracture in a reactor casing, things he had learned to feel through the soles of his boots before any scanner ever detected them. The silence that followed his request for his tool kit stretched into an unbearable gulf. Ambassador Voss's mind, a strategic engine in its own right, calculated the diplomatic fallout at a terrifying velocity. She saw centuries of careful preparation disintegrating. She saw the treaty collapsing. The Sulfuri insulted beyond repair, the Crevasse using this as a pretext for aggression. She needed to stop this. "Engineer Wren," she said, her voice a perfectly modulated instrument of calm, "the test is over. Your success is a credit to Earth. We do not need to." "Permission to speak freely, Ambassador." Wren cut her off, his tone still entirely flat, still staring at the puzzle. "I'm not trying to be difficult, but there's a substructural crack in the primary phase alignment node. I'd guess it's been there since the thing was forged. A million stress cycles later, it's about to shear. You let that happen while it's in an active state, and the dimensional bleed will vaporize everything in a 10-meter radius, including us." The matter-of-fact delivery was infinitely more terrifying than any dramatic warning. Cathar, the Crevasse warlord, rose from his shattered armrest. His scales rippled with predatory interest. The primate lies to save face. It solved the puzzle and now invents a flaw to appear even more capable, a dominance display. I have seen this in conquered species before. The Orathi observer, an entity designated only as Facet 1, made a sound like a slow, deliberate wind chime. The Crevasse's assumption is noted. However, my sensory suite detects a 0.03% deviation in the artifact's energy output post-completion, a variance so small it was deemed a rounding error in our analysis. The human detected it through direct tactile contact. This is of interest. The Sulfuri proctor sputtered. "A rounding error. The logic frame is a theoretical model, a masterwork of pure mathematics made manifest. It is not a piece of human machinery to be banged upon with primitive tools." Wren finally turned to face them all. His eyes, a pale gray that seemed to absorb the chamber's light, held no anger, only a profound, weary patience. He was a man who had spent his life explaining the obvious to people who thought they were smarter than him. "You're right," he said. "It's not a piece of machinery. It's a piece of precision engineering that your mathematicians mistook for a math problem. There's a difference. Math is perfect. Engineering is real. Real things have impurities. They fatigue. They break. You've been using a beautiful equation for 1,000 years and never once checked to see if the material holding it together was failing." He looked past the sputtering proctor, straight at Ambassador Voss. "My kit. The green one. It's got a molecular bonding agent rated for exotic matter substrates. If I don't apply it now, the alignment will hold for maybe 10 hours before the node shatters. It's their choice. But I can't just stand here and watch a beautiful machine tear itself apart because its designers were too proud to see it was sick." The word hung in the air. Sick. He wasn't accusing them of a flaw in their genius. He was diagnosing a patient. A piece of technology they revered as a holy relic, he treated as a wounded creature in need of a surgeon. Voss saw the shift in the room before anyone else. The Orathi were completely still, their faceted eyes reflecting 1,000 angles of Wren's determined face. They were not insulted. They were fascinated. The Sulfuri, the most intellectually arrogant species in the known galaxy, were facing a cognitive dissonance so profound their neural implants were likely overheating. And the Crevasse, Cathar's warlord gaze had moved from Wren to the glowing artifact. The political calculus had changed for him entirely. This wasn't a broken relic. This was a potential weapon. The choice belonged to the Sulfuri proctor. His thin frame seemed to deflate, the arrogance draining out of him, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. He looked at the glowing cube of perfect geometry. He had built his entire career, his spiritual life, around the infallibility of their ancient knowledge. And a scarred-handed primate from a death world was telling him the foundation was cracked. "You cannot," the proctor whispered, the words devoid of their earlier command, "to disassemble a sacred artifact. It is the highest blasphemy. The Crevasse will declare a crusade. The concordance will." "The concordance will watch," Facet 1 interrupted, its voice the serene tone of a recording glacier. "The Orathi delegation formally requests the human proceed. We wish to observe the repair for scientific and archival purposes. This was the turning point. The Orathi, the oldest and most inscrutable of the three, had just given their blessing. The Sulfuri's political shield vanished. Cathar, seeing the balance of power shift, sat back down with a predatory, toothy grin. Yes, proceed, human. Let us see if your bonding agent is as potent as your boasts. Ambassador Voss made a decision. It was the riskiest call of her career, but she had learned to trust her people. She gave Wren a single, sharp nod. A crewman from the human delegation, pale-faced and trembling, brought the heavy green case. Wren knelt on the polished floor, opened the latches, and withdrew a device that looked insultingly simple, a small, pen-like applicator, and a vial of liquid that shimmered with a dull, gray sheen. He turned back to the logic frame. The Sulfuri proctor watched with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. This was a nightmare, a low-tech nightmare unfolding in the heart of their most hallowed chamber. Wren reached into the solved puzzle with his bare hands. The dimensional shearing effect flickered again, but this time he had mapped the terrain. He knew where the edges were. His fingers found the seventh fold, the invisible seam in reality that the Sulfuri thought was pure theoretical space. It wasn't. It was a physical joint, and it was screaming. He applied the bonding agent. The dull gray liquid vanished into the invisible crack, and for a moment nothing happened. The proctor allowed himself a single, hopeful breath. Then the logic frame began to sing. A frequency of light and sound no living being in that chamber had ever experienced bloomed from the cube. The harmonic geometry didn't just align, it solidified. The projections on the walls of the chamber, previously a fatting documentation of the puzzle's state, suddenly snapped into a clarity so absolute, so breathtakingly detailed, that they didn't show a model of a wormhole anymore. They showed a stable, navigable set of spatial coordinates, a functioning, traversable passage. The human hadn't just fixed a relic. He had activated a piece of ancient technology so advanced, so forgotten, that the species who built it had spent millennia worshipping the lock without ever knowing it was a door. And Wren, with a tube of shipyard sealant, had just kicked it open. The scar that Wren had perceived, a flaw so subtle it had been incorporated into 1,000 years of religious dogma, was now the epicenter of a galactic revelation. The air in the Hall of Concordance thickened with a tension that was no longer political, but existential. Ambassador Voss's diplomatic mind, so recently braced for a catastrophic breakdown, now had to pivot with the speed of a combat pilot. The artifact wasn't a symbol anymore. It was an engine. The Sulfuri proctor looked at the projected star chart with an expression of spiritual annihilation. His entire theocracy had been built upon the interpretation of the logic frame's shifting symmetries as divine, unchangeable truths. Wren had just proven those truths were the equivalent of a manufacturer's defect that nobody had bothered to fix. The proctor's voice was a hollow, broken echo. "What have you done?" Wren was still kneeling, carefully wiping the excess bonding agent from the applicator with a cloth from his kit. He looked up, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion at the question. "I fixed the catch." The stress fracture was propagating along a microfissure in the exotic matter substrate. Another few decades of use and the entire primary node would have fractured, releasing a contained singularity burst. It would have looked like a small supernova. "You're welcome." The casual, almost bored delivery of "you're welcome" was the final straw for Cathar. The Krevash warlord descended from his gallery platform, his massive, scaled form moving with the terrifying speed of a born predator. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of the human, towering over Wren's still kneeling form. The translator rendered his guttural growl into sharp, imperative standard speech. "Rise, human," Cathar commanded. Wren finished wiping his tool, placed it carefully back in the case, and stood. He was at least a full head shorter than the Krevash, and perhaps a third of his body mass, yet he didn't step back. He just looked up at the warlord's slitted eyes with the same passive, diagnostic gaze he'd given the machine. The Sulfori have been tending to this relic since before my species harnessed fire. Cathar rumbled. And you, a bipedal mammal from a gravity well that should have crushed your bones to paste, tell us their devotion was founded on a flaw. Now the relic projects a map to a place we have no records of. You will explain how you did this. Now. It's not a map, Wren said, glancing back at the projection. The coordinates were mind-bending, a squirming tangle of higher-dimensional math that would have given a human astrophysicist an aneurysm. But to Wren, it was just another schematic. It's a diagnostic output. The fracture was acting as a damper, bleeding off energy that was meant to flow into a stable projection matrix. With the fracture sealed, the system completed its boot-up sequence. It's showing you the default operational baseline. That's a wormhole junction, 3-point spatial anchor, fully stable. Whoever built this thing used the logic puzzle as a security interface. The problem was, the lock was busted, so the door never opened. He shrugged. You didn't have a sacred puzzle, you had a broken starship ignition key. The silence that followed was the sound of an entire civilization being recontextualized. The Sulfori in the gallery were not moving. Their copper-hued bodies seemed to have turned to statues, their massive eyes fixed on the star chart that was now rewriting their entire history. Their greatest spiritual artifact was a key, a piece of functional technology. And they, the most intelligent minds in the known galaxy, had been spending centuries trying to commune with its divine geometry when all it needed was a maintenance check. Facet 1, the Orathi observer, glided forward. Its crystalline body refracted the light from the projection, scattering a constellation of false stars across the floor. Its voice was the slow, grinding sound of ancient ice. The human's explanation is consistent with all observable data. The Orathi delegation formally moves to have the Sulfori logic frame reclassified from a religious artifact to a functional piece of precursor technology, subject to joint scientific study. Our own analysis of the device, performed over the last 400 standard years, consistently flagged the seventh-fold variance as a characteristic harmonic. We, too, misread a flaw as a feature. This is a profound learning moment. The Sulfori proctor made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a scream of rage. You will not reclassify our heritage. This is a sacrilege. The human has defiled the sacred geometry with its primitive chemicals, and you congratulate it. I didn't defile anything, Wren said, his voice hardening for the first time. There was a dangerous edge to it now, a whisper of the gravity that had shaped his kind on a world that tried to kill them daily. I repaired a machine that was dying. You were worshipping a patient in agony, calling its death rattle a hymn. I don't care about your politics or your religion. I care about engineering. And that, he pointed at the pristine, glowing cube, is a beautiful piece of engineering that should not have been left to rot in a theological museum. Ambassador Voss stepped in, her heels clicking a sharp, definitive rhythm on the polished floor. Her presence was a wave of practiced authority that pushed back the swelling tide of Crevash aggression and Sulfori hysteria. She placed herself physically between Wren and the warlord. Esteemed delegates, she said, her voice amplified by the chamber's acoustic field, Earth did not come here to dismantle your culture. We came to prove our cognitive worth. My engineer has done so, albeit in a way none of us anticipated. The fact remains that a previously non-functional piece of precursor technology is now active. It represents a paradigm shift for every species in this room. The question is no longer whether humanity deserves a seat at the table. The question is, what do we all do with the door that has just been opened? Cathar's predatory grin widened. I will answer that, human diplomat. The door leads to a weapon that will break the deadlock of the three great powers. My armada will claim it. The galaxy will finally know a single, unified rule. He slammed a scaly fist into his palm, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. This changes everything. He turned to leave, already barking orders into a wrist-mounted communicator, his soldiers in the gallery snapping to attention. But he only made it 3 steps before Ren's voice, calm as a frozen lake, stopped him. "You might want to hold that order, General." Cathar froze. He turned, his slitted eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. "You dare give me commands, Primate?" Ren didn't flinch. "Not a command, just a fact. The bonding agent I used is a temporary fix, a patch, not a cure. The alloy the node is made from has a fatigue lifespan. It'll hold for another 50, maybe 60 cycles, and then the microfractures will propagate again, only this time it'll be a cascade failure. Without the proper molecular reforging, your new weapon is just a bomb with a very short fuse. And I'm the only person in the galaxy who knows the alloy composition and the stress tolerance needed to forge a new one." The declaration hung in the air, a truth more devastating than any armada. The Krevash warlord, a being who had conquered a dozen species, was suddenly, irrevocably dependent on the one creature in the room he had dismissed as a primitive. Ren looked past him, back at Ambassador Voss, and gave her the faintest, almost imperceptible nod. The negotiation had shifted. They weren't asking for a seat at the table anymore. They owned the table. The anatomy of a god engine lay bare before them all. The Sulfuri Proctor's spiritual collapse was now a palpable thing, a dying star in the center of the chamber. His copper skin had dulled, his posture crumbling under the weight of a heresy that was not a matter of debate but of physics. The shifting, divine geometry he had spent his life interpreting was a malfunction. The human, this grease-stained creature from a world of tectonic violence, had not committed an act of vandalism. He had performed an autopsy on a millennium of misplaced faith. Cathar's fury was a caged, superheated plasma. The coordinates of a strategic superweapon pulsed on the air, taunting him, and the key to unlocking its long-term potential was held in the scarred hands of the one being he was culturally conditioned to crush. He loomed over Ren, his breath a hot wind smelling of ozone and copper. "You lie. You seek to make yourself indispensable to avoid execution." Ren met his gaze without aggression, only the unnerving calm of a man holding a live detonator. "I don't care if you execute me. I'm telling you the material properties of the node as I felt them. The molecular lattice is degrading. The bond I applied is a flex seal, a shipyard patch designed for hull breaches on cargo freighters. It bought you time. It didn't forge a new skeleton. If you activate that wormhole interface more than a few dozen times, the exotic matter matrix will destabilize and detonate. That's not a threat. That's a material specification." The Orathi observer, Facet 1, moved its crystalline bulk closer to the artifact. Its body, a shifting lattice of living silicate, extended a microfine whisker of sensor crystal, probing the energy field around the now-active logic frame. The chamber held its collective breath. After a long moment, the Orathi spoke, its voice the sound of grinding continental plates. "The human's assessment is verified. My scans indicate the node's crystalline structure is laced with fatigue voids. The foreign bonding agent is acting as a compressible gasket, allowing the structure to flex rather than shear. It is a crude solution, but functionally brilliant. A permanent repair would require smelting and reforging the node in a zero-gravity exotic matter foundry. We have no such facility. The precursors did, but their industrial knowledge was lost with them." The admission was a seismic shockwave. The Orathi, the keepers of the oldest continuous knowledge in the galaxy, had just confessed their ignorance in the face of human engineering. They didn't see it as a defeat, though. Facet 1's eyes, a million-faceted mirrors, turned towards Ren with an expression that could only be described as intellectual hunger. "You perceive the physical reality beneath the theoretical construct. This is a cognitive architecture our species has not encountered. We wish to understand how you learned to diagnose a piece of technology you had never seen before." Ren considered the question, his scarred hands resting on his tool kit. He thought of his childhood on the orbital shipyards of Callisto, where he learned to weld in a vacuum at 12 years old. He thought of the war years, patching destroyer hulls while railgun slugs punched holes through the deck beneath his feet. He thought of 1,000 disasters averted not by genius, but by the gut-deep intuition that a machine was about to scream before it made a sound. "Everything breaks," Wren said. "That's the first thing you learn. No such thing as a perfect system. Entropy always wins. The precursors, you, the crevasse, you all built your technology to be final, complete. You look at a machine and see a solved equation. A human looks at a machine and sees a fight against decay that we're always, eventually, going to lose. We just try to lose later rather than sooner. That changes how you listen to the hardware. You don't look for the harmony. You listen for the strain. It's not a philosophy, it's just practice." The Silfori Proctor let out a strangled, desperate cry. "A fight against decay. That is your grand revelation. Our entire culture was founded on the pursuit of eternal, perfect forms. The precursors achieved godhood because they transcended decay." Wren shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound, exhausted pity. "They didn't transcend it. They just got really, really good at hiding it. And then they were gone. And the one piece of their tech that survived was broken, and you spent 1,000 years polishing the fracture instead of healing it. That's not a failure of intelligence. It's a failure of perspective." Ambassador Voss saw the opening and stepped into it with the precision of a master surgeon. The political landscape had shifted from a petition for entry to a hostage negotiation, and now, finally, to a lesson. "The human perspective," Voss said, her voice carrying across the stunned silence, "is exactly what we are offering the Galactic Accord. Not as a curiosity, not as a client species, but as a partner with a unique cognitive and cultural toolkit. My engineer just demonstrated that our primitive approach to technology can solve problems your advanced methods literally could not see. We are not here to replace your gods. We are here to fix the machines they left behind, and to face the decay you have been pretending does not exist." She gestured towards the star chart, the pulsing coordinates of the precursor wormhole junction. "That door was locked because it was broken. We are the species that fixes broken doors. The only question that remains is whether you want to walk through it with us, or keep staring at a beautiful, sealed entrance until the lights go out." Cathar's expression was a war map of conflicting instincts. His lust for the weapon was a burning sun, but his strategic mind, honed by 100 years of conquest, recognized a new variable when it shattered his preconceptions. The humans were not physically imposing. Their technology was a patchwork of brute force solutions and evolutionary kludges. But their ability to see weakness, to diagnose the fatal flaw in any system, be it mechanical, political, or personal, was a weapon more terrifying than any planet cracker. He made a decision, a predator's decision made to preserve the hunt. "The crevasse will not oppose Earth's entry into the Accord," he growled, the words seeming to cause him physical pain. "Provided the human engineer remains attached to the artifact reclamation project, he will fix the node. He will teach my own engineers his diagnostic methods, and when the weapon beyond that door is found, the crevasse will have primary claim." Voss smiled, a thin, diplomatic blade of an expression. "A discussion for the formal treaty signing, I'm sure. Engineer Wren will remain as a technical consultant under Earth's diplomatic authority. His knowledge will be shared but directed." She turned to the Silfori Proctor, who was now a husk of his former arrogance. "And the Silfori, does your delegation have any further objections to our cognitive capabilities?" The Proctor opened his mouth, but no sound came. His worldview was crumbling in real time. The ancient, perfect geometry he worshipped was a broken lock. His gods were engineers, not deities, and the creature who had revealed this truth was now waiting patiently for him to admit it. The blasphemy of repair became a spectacle that would be etched into the memory of the galaxy. Wren knelt before the logic frame, his green tool kit splayed open like a surgeon's tray on the polished floor of the Hall of Concordance. The chamber, designed for grand oratory and ritualistic display, had become an operating theater. The gallery lights, once casting an aura of divine judgment, now served as harsh, practical work lamps. The three most powerful species in the known galaxy watched in a state of collective, horrified fascination. The Sulfuri Proctor had retreated to his delegation, his body language a symphony of collapse. His acolytes surrounded him, their copper faces reflecting a crisis of faith so profound it was almost audible, a low, keening psychic static that bled through their translation fields. They watched Ren's hands move with the morbid dread of parishioners watching a stranger dissect their god. Ren was oblivious to the theological catastrophe unfolding behind him. He had entered a state of hyper-focused calm, the mechanical trance that every master engineer knows. To him, the logic frame was no longer a sacred relic or a terrifying weapon. It was a problem, a beautiful, intricate dying machine, and he was going to save it. The primary node alloy is a ternary exotic matter composite, he said. His voice, a low, running narration, meant more for his own concentration than for the alien audience. The fatigue voids are concentrated along the latitudinal flexure plane. Someone overtorqued the calibration on this thing about 800 years ago. Classic overcorrection, probably trying to purify the alignment, created a stress fracture that's been propagating ever since. Facet 1, the Orathi, hovered closer, its crystalline sensor whiskers recording every motion. Our historical archives indicate a Sulfuri great reharmonization ritual conducted 847 standard years ago. The artifact was reported to be shimmering with renewed divine vigor after the ceremony. We now understand this was the moment the structural damage was inflicted. A strangled cry echoed from the Sulfuri gallery. The Proctor's senior acolyte, a younger Sulfuri with bright, horrified eyes, had just heard his civilization's proudest spiritual moment reframed as a botched maintenance job. The irony was a blade twisting in their collective gut. "Figures," Ren muttered, not unkindly. He withdrew a device from his kit, a molecular bonding applicator that looked to the alien observers insultingly primitive. It was a handheld wand, heavy and industrial, patched with heat tape and bearing the faded logo of a Martian shipyard. To beings who manipulated matter with thought engines and probability fields, this was a caveman's club. Yet, the caveman was about to perform open-heart surgery on their most advanced piece of technology. The bonding agent is a self-assembling polymer lattice. It's designed to mimic the crystalline structure of high-tensile exotic alloys. It won't be as strong as a full reforging, but it'll arrest the fatigue propagation and give the node enough structural integrity for, I'd say, 200 operational cycles. Enough time for you to build a proper smelting facility. He applied the agent. The wand emitted a soft, high-frequency hum, and the shimmering gray liquid flowed into the invisible crack on the seventh-dimensional fold. The process was agonizingly slow, a microsurgery conducted on a wound only Ren could feel. To the alien observers, he was simply moving a humming stick over empty air, but the readouts on the logic frame were shifting. The chaotic, beautiful patterns that had defined Sulfuri theology for a millennium were stabilizing. The sacred geometry wasn't being destroyed, it was being corrected. Cathar watched with the coiled intensity of a predator judging a rival's strength. His tactical mind was reeling. The human had reduced a superweapon to a patient, and was fixing it with a tool that could have been built in a cave. This was not a fluke of one gifted individual. This was a species-wide cognitive trait. A species that could look at a god and see a malfunctioning component was a species that could look at his empire and see the same. "Engineer Ren," Cathar growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You say the precursor's technology was meant to be functional, not divine. What else do you see when you look at this artifact?" Ren didn't look up from his work. "I see a beautifully built machine that was abandoned before it was finished. It's an interface terminal, a control console. It was meant to be used, not worshipped. The divine harmonies you were all studying, those are status indicators. The shifting fractal patterns are a diagnostic display showing the operational health of a much larger network. This node was meant to connect to something else, something the precursors never got around to activating. He paused, tilting his head as if listening to a distant sound. There's a power-down sequence buried in the base code, a hibernation mode. The whole network is still out there, sleeping. This little puzzle box was the alarm clock you never let ring. The implication detonated across the chamber like a psychic bomb. The precursors, the vanished gods who had seeded the galaxy with life and mystery, had left behind not just relics, but a fully integrated, galaxy-spanning infrastructure. And it was still alive, waiting for a wake-up call that 1,000 years of religious obfuscation had never allowed. Ambassador Voss felt the floor shift beneath her. This was no longer a diplomatic victory. This was a paradigm shift. Earth had arrived as a petitioner. In the span of a single hour, they had become the inheritors of the galaxy's greatest secret. The political map of the Accord was being redrawn in real time, and the new center of gravity was Ren's scarred, grease-stained hands. "Done," Ren said, sitting back on his heels. He wiped the applicator wand clean and placed it back in his kit. The logic frame pulsed with a steady, deep blue light. The chaotic shifts were gone. In their place was a serene, almost minimalist display of interconnected nodes. A map, a control interface, a to-do list left by the gods. The Silphori Proctor stumbled forward, breaking away from his horrified acolytes. He stared at the new display, his eyes reflecting the deep blue light. The divine chaos he had spent his life interpreting was gone. In its place was something far more terrifying: order, purpose, function. What does it say?" he whispered, his voice stripped of all authority. Ren stood, his knees cracking in the profound silence. He looked at the display, his brow furrowing for a moment as he parsed the ancient script. Then he read it aloud, his flat, shipyard tone utterly at odds with the cosmic weight of the words. "System boot complete. Maintenance cycle required for nodes 12, 39, and 84. Primary network uplink pending. Welcome back." The gods hadn't ascended. They had just been waiting for tech support. When a god learns to kneel, the universe watches in silence. The Silphori Proctor fell to his knees. It was not a graceful, ritualistic genuflection, the kind prescribed by ancient texts and performed before the shifting face of the logic frame. It was a collapse, a physical, spiritual, and intellectual capitulation under the weight of a revelation that shattered the very foundation of his existence. The copper-skinned being, who had entered the Hall of Concordance as the arbiter of human inferiority, now wept with a sound like tearing silk. His acolytes did not rush to his aid. They were staring, transfixed, at the message that pulsed serenely on the artifact's new display. "Welcome back." The words were a greeting and a damnation. The gods they had worshipped for 1,000 years had been waiting for them to stop praying and start fixing, and they had failed, utterly. A primate from a death world had succeeded where their entire civilization had faltered. Cathar had no sympathy for theological crises. His gaze was locked on the network map, the pulsing nodes that represented dormant precursor facilities scattered across the galaxy. A galaxy-spanning infrastructure, waiting to be claimed. The military implications were beyond staggering, but his path to conquest was blocked by a single, insurmountable obstacle: the human engineer who held the key to activating it all. He looked at Ren with a new expression. It was not respect. The Krevesh did not respect lesser species. It was a cold, pragmatic recalibration of threat assessment. The human was not a primitive. He was a specialist of a kind the Krevesh had never encountered, a master of the broken and the dormant. To kill him would be to destroy the key to the greatest weapon in history. To capture him would invite the wrath of an entire species of similar specialists. The math of conquest had suddenly become terrifyingly complex. Ambassador Voss stepped into the vacuum of power. Her diplomatic instincts, honed by a career spent navigating the razor-edged politics of a galaxy that saw humanity as a footnote, were now operating at their peak. She had just witnessed her engineer accidentally usurp the role of a god's chosen prophet. The political capital was immeasurable, and she intended to spend it all. "Esteemed delegates," she said, her voice a perfectly modulated instrument of calm authority, cutting through the chaos of the Sulfuri collapse and the Crevash calculation. "The situation has evolved beyond the original parameters of this test. Earth came here to prove cognitive capability and seek entry into the galactic accord. What we have instead proven is that the precursor legacy is not a collection of divine mysteries, but a functional, repairable infrastructure. Infrastructure that my people are uniquely equipped to restore." She gestured towards the network map, the 12 blinking nodes that signaled maintenance requests from a dead civilization. "This is no longer a negotiation for a seat at the table. This is a proposal for a partnership. Earth will lead the precursor restoration initiative. Our engineers, our technicians, our diagnosticians will be granted unrestricted access to all dormant precursor sites within Accord space. In exchange, the resulting technology and infrastructure will be shared, under license, with all member species who sign the new Earth-led cooperative framework." The terms were a diplomatic earthquake. She was not asking for entry. She was dictating the terms of a new galactic order. And the aliens, reeling from the destruction of their most fundamental beliefs, had no choice but to listen. Facet 1, the Orathi, was the first to respond. The ancient crystalline being extended its sensor whiskers towards the pulsing map, its faceted eyes reflecting 1,000 angles of the new reality. Its voice was the slow, deliberate grinding of glaciers reshaping a continent. "The Orathi delegation has witnessed a paradigm shift. Our species has existed for eons, preserving the knowledge of the precursors without understanding it. We were curators of a gallery, not engineers of the machines. The human diagnostic methodology represents a fundamental advancement in cognitive architecture. We will sign this cooperative framework. We wish to learn to see what the human sees." One of the three great powers had just bent the knee, not to an empire, not to a fleet, but to a way of thinking. Cathar's growl was a low, volcanic rumble. His strategic mind was a whirlwind of cost-benefit calculations, each one ending in the same infuriating conclusion. Earth was too valuable to crush and too dangerous to ignore. He looked at Ren, still standing quietly by his tool kit, his expression utterly unreadable. "You have not conquered us, human diplomat," Cathar snarled. "The Crevash do not kneel, but we recognize a temporary strategic alignment when it is forced upon us. The Crevash will join this restoration initiative, with conditions. My warriors will accompany every expedition. My tacticians will oversee the military applications of any recovered technology. This is non-negotiable." Voss inclined her head, accepting the terms with a grace that masked the fierce triumph blazing in her chest. She had tamed the warlord, not with fear but with utility. She had made humanity indispensable, and indispensability was the most durable form of power in a galaxy of shifting alliances. All eyes turned to the Sulfuri. The proctor was still on his knees, but his weeping had subsided. He looked up, his ancient eyes meeting Ren's steady, gray gaze. In that moment, the entire hierarchy of galactic intelligence was inverted. The representative of the most intellectually arrogant species in the Accord was looking up at a creature he had dismissed as a primate and seeing a savior. "You fixed it," the proctor whispered, his voice raw. "The divine harmony, it was broken, and you fixed it." Ren shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the intensity of the alien's gaze. He wasn't a diplomat. He wasn't a hero. He was a mechanic, and a broken machine was the only thing in the universe that made sense to him. "It was a stress fracture," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the absolute silence of the hall. "Anyone could have fixed it. You just needed to know how to listen." The proctor shook his head, a gesture of profound, exhausted understanding. "We listened for the music of the spheres. You listened for the grinding of gears. Our ears were not capable of hearing what you heard. The Sulfuri will sign your framework, Ambassador. We have a millennium of penance to perform, and a galaxy of broken machines to help repair. The Hall of Concordance, the monument to galactic arrogance, had become the birthplace of a new era. An era not of divine mysteries, but of practical problems. An era where the gods were just engineers who had left their tools behind. And the most valuable beings in the universe were not the ones who worshipped the machine, but the ones who knew how to fix it. Ambassador Voss allowed herself a single, private moment of release. The tension in her shoulders, held for 6 years of grueling diplomatic preparation, finally eased. They had won. Not a battle, not a treaty, but something far greater. They had redefined the game entirely. Then Ren cleared his throat. "Ambassador," he said, his tone still flat, still utterly unimpressed by the cosmic drama unfolding around him. "About that table." The new center of gravity was a wobbling leg. Ambassador Voss turned, her triumphant speech dying on her lips. The entire chamber, still reeling from the cosmic paradigm shift, now watched as the human engineer pointed at the physical manifestation of their diplomatic authority. The table, the massive, ornate slab of polished stone and precious alloy that served as the central negotiating platform for the Galactic Accord. It was a relic of a different kind, a symbol of the power balance that had governed the galaxy for millennia. And Ren was looking at it with the same diagnostic frown he had given the logic frame. "It's got a wobble," he said, as if that explained everything. Thar, his strategic calculations grinding to a halt, let out a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a baffled sigh. "The table is a ceremonial platform, human. Its structural integrity is irrelevant." Ren shook his head, already walking towards the massive stone slab. "No, it's not. You've got 3 species who are about to sign the most important treaty in 10,000 years, and you're going to do it on a table that rocks every time someone leans on it. That's not ceremonial. That's just bad engineering." He knelt beside the table, ignoring the flabbergasted stares of the galaxy's most powerful beings. His scarred hands found the offending leg, a massive pillar of carved obsidian that had been slightly, almost imperceptibly, worn down over centuries of use. A millimeter of erosion, a fraction of a degree of tilt. To the Sulfuri, it was a charming quirk of an ancient artifact. To the Orathi, it was an irrelevant physical detail. To the Krevash, it didn't exist at all. To Ren, it was a problem. "The floor plating underneath this leg has micro-fractured," he announced, his voice carrying the same matter-of-fact authority he had used to diagnose the precursor relic. "Probably from the weight distribution. The leg's been slowly sinking for about 300 years, give or take. You've all been signing your peace treaties on a 3-degree incline." Facet 1 glided forward, its crystalline body refracting the light in patterns of pure fascination. "Our records indicate the table was installed 2,100 standard years ago. We have never detected any flaw." "Because you weren't looking for one," Ren said, already pulling a small, flat disc from his tool kit, a load distribution plate, standard equipment for any human construction site. He slid it under the worn leg with the precision of a master craftsman. The massive stone table, which had wobbled for 3 centuries, settled into perfect, immovable stability. "It's just like the puzzle. You saw what you expected to see, a perfect symbol, a sacred geometry. You didn't see the physical reality underneath." He stood, brushing the dust from his knees, there, fixed. The silence that followed was different from the others. It was not the silence of shock or horror or spiritual collapse. It was the silence of dawning, profound realization. The human had just done it again. Not on a cosmic scale, not with a precursor artifact, but with a piece of furniture. And in that small, almost absurd act of repair, he had demonstrated the core truth of his species with more eloquence than any speech could muster. Humans did not just solve grand puzzles or repair ancient machines. They fixed the wobble in the table. They noticed the small, annoying, persistent flaws that everyone else had learned to ignore. They looked at the universe not as a divine mystery to be worshipped or a battlefield to be conquered, but as a collection of problems to be solved. And they solved them, all of them, the cosmic and the mundane, with equal dedication. Ambassador Voss looked at Wren, her diplomatic mask cracking into a genuine, exhausted smile. He was still just standing there, his tool kit in his hand, looking vaguely uncomfortable with all the attention. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a symbol. He was a mechanic who had fixed a table because the wobble bothered him, and in doing so, he had just explained humanity better than she ever could. Cathar stared at the now perfectly stable table. His predator's mind, so adept at seeing weakness and exploiting it, was now seeing something else entirely. He was seeing a species that could not tolerate broken things, a species that would, inevitably and inexorably, fix every flaw they encountered, including the flaws in his empire, including the flaws in him. They were not a threat in the traditional sense. They were something far more terrifying. They were an immune system for reality itself. The Crevasse will not oppose Earth's motion to host the new Restoration Initiative headquarters, he said, his voice a low, gravelly surrender. Let them be the ones who fix what is broken. Better to have them inside the tent, fixing the tent, than outside, noticing how it wobbles. The Sulphuri Proctor, still on his knees, looked at the stable table. He thought of his sacred geometry, his divine harmonies, his 1,000 years of misplaced worship. He thought of the wobble, the tiny flaw that everyone had accepted as part of perfection, and he began to laugh. It was not a hysterical laugh, but a genuine, liberating release. All this time, he said, his voice shaking with the absurdity of it all. All this time we were praying to a broken machine and negotiating peace on a tilted table. The gods were not testing our faith. They were waiting for a plumber. Facet 1 made a sound that, in any human context, would have been called a chuckle. The Orathi delegation formally proposes a new addition to the Galactic Accord Charter. Henceforth, all ceremonial artifacts will be subject to a mandatory structural integrity review, conducted by humans. Ambassador Voss stepped forward and placed her hand on the now stable table. The polished stone was cool beneath her palm, solid, unmoving, the perfect foundation for what was to come. I believe we have a treaty to draft, she said, her voice ringing with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a species that had just found its place in the universe. Not as supplicants, not as conquerors, but as the people you call when something important is broken. The delegates began to assemble around the table, the Sulphuri humbled and reborn, the Crevasse recalculating and adapting, the Orathi recording and learning, and at the center of it all the human delegation, no longer outsiders. They were the architects of a new order, an order built not on the worship of perfection, but on the relentless, compassionate, and utterly dangerous human need to make things right. Wren, dismissed from the immediate attention, quietly closed his tool kit. He looked around the hall of concordance, at the shifting light of the nebulae, the stunned faces of the alien delegates, the pulsing map of a sleeping galactic network waiting to be awakened. Then he looked at Ambassador Voss, who was already deep in negotiation, her words shaping the future of 100 civilizations. He caught her eye and gave her a single, small nod, a mechanic's salute. The job was done, the machine was stable. Then he turned to Facet 1, who was still hovering nearby, watching him with an unreadable crystalline expression. You mentioned you had other broken things you wanted looked at, he asked, his tone as casual as if he were offering to fix a neighbor's lawnmower. I've got some time before we head back. The Orathi observer, the oldest continuous consciousness in the known galaxy, extended a crystalline appendage and gently touched the human's shoulder. Engineer Wren, it said, its ancient voice carrying a warmth that defied its silicate nature. We have been waiting for your species for a very long time. Wren shrugged, a human gesture that contained multitudes of meaning. Sorry we're late, traffic was bad. And in the hall of concordance, beneath the light of ancient stars, a mechanic from Earth opened his tool kit and got back to work. The galaxy was broken, and someone had to fix it.